gentlemen, fantastic motion, for it is this House, namely the opposition method, that we intend to take to school today. What is the model that we propose? In terms of when we think this should start, we think it should happen at a very early age. We should screen, namely put better students into school classes with other students of a similar level of ability at the earliest possible age, that is, the level of age in which we can start going into feeder schools, that kind of thing. We would assess this based on standardised tests at the beginning, and then complement that with assessments of their educational attainment within class. We'll also support both the creation of high-performing schools overall, but also streaming within schools based subject by subject. So better performing students in mathematics will be grouped in top maths classes, ditto for sports, ditto for English, and so on for like arts, culture, whatever. Okay, so what am I going to show you in this speech? Firstly, I'm going to show you that to the extent that we should focus on one group of children, there is an argument for that group being better, being more intelligent and better students. However, I'm then going to show you that this does produce better educational outcomes for all groups. I'm then going to talk about the social equalizer effect, and finally, incentive to teach. So firstly, why is it legitimate for us to focus on providing effective educational outcomes for the top performing students? We say this because the benefits society receives from their attainment are exponential compared to their level of ability, and it is therefore an incredibly effective return on educational investment. Why is that? Because firstly, they get access, because they get access to better kinds of jobs that pay large amounts of money and contribute to the economy, but more importantly, because we can then tax those progressively and redistribute that income through society, providing a greater level overall. However, this moves me to my first main point. Why does this produce incredibly abstruse questions from the best students, right? Okay, secondly, I want to talk about a social equalising effect, because we say streaming does exist, Mr. Speaker, but it exists insofar as the wealthy send their students to private schools and give them tuition. At an early age, though, Mr. Speaker, we think differences in ability between the wealthy and poor are more or less negligible, particularly within schools, because you already have a degree of students within a geographical area and thereby school are less economically diverse than students across society, okay? So doing this gives all students an ability or a chance to perform in those top-level classes. That means several things. Firstly, it gives them access to the kinds of cohorts that currently only the wealthy receive. Access to the kinds of teachers who want to teach those kinds of students and are inspired by the idea of teaching those students. And, more importantly, the idea that they are top-performing students and can have a place in the best class, in the top class. That is something that is of enormous value to students, and they will never receive it, Mr. Speaker, if they continue to be beaten down by a few top performers and therefore cannot get that. It is simply easier to envisage yourself completing a journey if you break that journey down into steps. And by taking the very best students out of the class and putting them with the best students of other classes, you thereby make it easier for the students in that first class to envisage becoming better and becoming the best student in their class. In terms of an incentive to teach, we say that there are many teachers who are simply unwilling to teach kids who they think come from at-risk backgrounds, and that is a disincentive to teach. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, we think that teachers from different pathways are better suited to different kinds of students. Teachers with a background in education and child psychology and development studies are better suited to teaching underperforming students, but teachers who have a PhD in mathematics but only marginal education in terms of education itself are much better qualified to teaching high-performing students because they're incredibly switched on in the subject matter of teaching. Mr. Speaker, we think this is a fantastic idea. We're very happy to propose.
Mr. Speaker, quite simply, this policy facilitates the identification of minority individuals who are likely to perform worse at schools at an early age, and it guarantees that they will fall back. That is why we're in today's debate competition. There's an astounding misunderstanding of the Prime Minister and formulaic conception of education. One of the most simplistic conceptions of education I've ever heard. One that simply thinks that competition, this word that applies in economics, is the only thing that applies in education. I'll show you why it's simply not true. Three things I'm going to do. First thing, very well taught. Second thing, I'll just point out the benefits of the status quo, why we get benefits for the best ability students and for the lower ability students, and we have cooperative arrangements in schools. Secondly, I'll point to the harms that accrue from this policy, harms of self-esteem, parental pressure, why that self-esteem harm particularly applies to minorities. Looking at a few education studies, a bit about African-American achievement in America, that was implicit, and then finally looking at how racial minorities and parents feel targeted by the perception of this policy, and are likely to disengage with those schools and education. Right? So, let's start with Roberto. He says this policy is legitimate simply because it's likely to reduce results. We're very happy that that's the tactic taken. We think this debate should fall on whether you can achieve better educational results for children. We don't think you do over a certain class. The first thing he talks about is competition and how it drives educational attainment. Right? Firstly, formulate understanding of education. Competition is one of the ways that we drive educational attainment. Another one is cooperation. Groups of people working towards a target, non-competitive, right? Non-didactic learning methods that allow peer-to-peer methods of learning, whereby we share and help each other to do things together, right? Non-competitive do apply. Simply no analysis as to why competition is the best, or even the only way to teach people, right? Nonsense. The next thing we bring is you can still be driven to compete by being challenged by your teacher, right? Competition doesn't need to be amongst your peers. It can be as a basis of intellectual attainment, so I can set you a standard and see who reaches. Come from your teacher, even if you buy into this idea that competition is a necessary driver for educational attainment, right? Finally on this, just ask most of the Oxford final year students what excessive academic pressure can do. You can often encourage people to break down, disengage entirely, and perform badly because of it, right? So, the next thing he talks about is if you teach too quickly or too slowly, right? That's a reason not to teach too quickly or too slowly. It's also a very unsophisticated understanding of how a curriculum works, right? Within a particular curriculum, for example, you teach about Native Americans and teach some students at a faster pace and some students at a slower pace. Not a reason to do this policy, never analysis why. No. Then he says at an early age, the differences between the wealthy and the poor are negligible. No analysis as to why. It seems impossible right? The context is that the students that are likely to be singled out at an early age fit within a particular social structure. Firstly, they have natural development delays, or secondly, they may have undetected learning difficulties that they don't want to discover much later in life. And thirdly, they may have different learning aptitudes, may learn simply better from cooperative schemes, non-didactic learning tactics, right? This policy means that those people are prejudiced from an early age such that by the time they get to secondary school and realise they aren't that's what you're definitely lose, right? So let's look at the benefits that accrue from the status quo. Peer-to-peer learning, right, is extremely beneficial for both sets of children. We know that because, well, if you've read any academic evidence, it shows that using the best and brightest students do encourage the worst, right? That's a fact. I'll show you why it's a plausible fact. Now, firstly, teaching, the process of best students, teaching the worst, clarifies their understanding, right? Instruction clarifies understanding, it ratifies it. Secondly, bear in mind the third stage of memorizing all knowledge is teaching it, it allows you to utilize it, it makes it easier for you to recall at a time that's appropriate, right? Why is this better for the worst performing students? Partly because they are non-receptive to authoritarian figures, right? They prefer learning in non-didactic ways, i.e. not being told directly what the answer is. So they prefer to engage and clarify and share in the group, and as a consequence, learn better. And that kind of environment suits them more. But what are the harms that accrue when you change the status quo and the benefits I've just talked about for one that favours these most talented individuals and doesn't benefit them as far as they're concerned? First, you get an incredible self-esteem. Kids know that they're in the stupid class. Not least because these things operate subtly, it's disguised, and frankly, it's impossible to disguise it effectively, right? When everybody in class is in detention, you happen to recognise that you're in a not very good group, right? Two consequences. One, you can sometimes be the subject of bullying, right? Even when that's not true, you still feel worse about themselves. Now, that may manifest itself in strange ways, right? They might choose to disengage or misbehave or pretend they don't care, but that is nevertheless evidence of the fact that it's affected those students, right? I'll take a look in a moment. It's then hard for them to learn. Look at the impact it has on minorities in particular.
You can't write here about group learning. Group learning only works in similar to classrooms. Otherwise, all you have is a delicate, deferring ability within playing on those students.
Well, I mean, deferring seems interchangeable with learning from. I mean, it's a really good thing that in those group circumstances, you can learn from the best students and thereby challenge them on how they answer what they came to, right? So you have to be far more to set that. So look at what happens to African Americans. In the United States, there was a study when black students took a test. The word black was associated with stupid, worthless, and non-significant in non-racial contexts, right? And they performed worse on all those tests because the social environment is stimulated attached, and the environment they grew up in that says black students who are going to perform less, those children are vastly more susceptible to the kinds of priming that this policy subjects them to. They are much more likely to feel affected by the fact that you've told them they are stupid. As a consequence, they are less likely to achieve the kinds of things we want them to. Look at how horrible that is. These are the people that are the most vulnerable in most societies across the world, and therefore we think should not be prejudiced or adjusted by this policy. Third, you get parental pressure. And this often manifests itself incorrectly. It's just unclear what parents can do to help children get to achieve better grades, right? And often just do things incorrectly and don't drive the students in ways that are likely to improve education and attainment. They may just be disengaged and talk about their children as stupid in ways that disparage, disencourage them to engage in education. No analysis as to why we get any kind of parental engagement once we introduce this policy that supports those children we think is likely, particularly amongst the poorest, to be negative. And finally, racial minorities feel targeted when you put the children in bad schools, in bad classrooms. They feel like you've done it for their rights. Not because their child is stupid. That's what stops them engaging in school and doing the things that help their children achieve more. This is the most ridiculous policy, and I'll hopefully see you in the fall.
Ladies and gentlemen, what private schools all across the world, state schools that have tried this, and charter schools in America that have tried this policy have found is that it works. It's as simple as that. The way that it makes students behave when they're in the classroom means that all students achieve better. And in particular, it lifts those students who otherwise have no hope because of the background that they come from, or because of class dynamics or otherwise this is. It lifts those children and gives them that ambition, and gives them that belief that they can get into the next class and the next group, and it makes them achieve better as well. So I'm very proud to stand on this side of the house. There are four things I want to talk about in this speech. Firstly, why this policy lifts standards. Secondly, why this policy is good for, in terms of its social effects. Thirdly, why this policy is good for the self-perception of students. And fourthly, why this policy is good for interaction between students and schools. Firstly, on standards. The response to Twain's analysis about competition was to simply deny that competition is important as an aspect of human nature, despite the fact, and also the false claim that we're doing no analysis to prove that is true. To some extent, it's hard to give reasons for the fact or the matter that competition is a part of human nature. But what Tom does give you is some examples, some ways of understanding why competition is important to people generally, the fact that they have a desire to succeed, and the fact that people measure their success relative to their peers in almost all walks of life, not just relative to their own previous successes, because measuring yourself for your own previous successes is still isolated from the rest of society and your peer group. But moreover, it isn't just true if you think about the way that schools work all over the world. If you think about the way that sport in schools works, for example, that kids are just immensely competitive and they want to do well, and they want to do well relative to other people. Then he says, competition is just one value which you can have, there are also other values like cooperation which might be as good. I'm not sure why they might be as good. So within a class, it's possible that you might have cooperation, for example, on a project. When kids do projects in class, often those projects get better when there are different groups doing different projects, and what one want to do especially well in order to impress by doing better than other people who are doing the same task. That actually is true. Moreover, on this point about competition, what they can see is that parents do sometimes place pressure on their kids. That's clearly true. Obviously, excessive pressure is bad, but the pressure that parents do place on their kids, even at a young age, does mean that there is another reason for believing that competition does occur. Because if the competition comes from the extent to which their parents want them to do well, it is true that their parents want them to do well relative to other kids, because educational outcomes are a relative game, right? You do well, and you do well, and therefore have a greater chance of getting into university because you do better than other people who would otherwise get that place. Then they say, the pressure is particularly bad in these cases. But the pressure is, the feeling of pressure in the classroom is more when you feel out of your depth. Okay, the pressure is more when you're in a class where you feel like however much you do, you can never quite keep up. You feel like everyone else in the class is gaining on you, and you are just in that situation. Then they say, there are no problems with different paces in different classes. I mean, if you're reading a book and you have vastly different reading ages in your classroom, and some people just are reading and comprehending that book much faster than other kids, then it means you can't go at one pace, right? It means you can't go because people will just be left behind. I mean, that's just almost definitionally true. So, to the extent that they do go at one pace, right, when say reading a book or learning a piece of maths, it means they have to go to the lowest level in the class, and that is very bad for everyone else. Moreover, it doesn't even come to the lowest level that much because it means that they know that everyone else is half ahead of them, and they do lose confidence in that. Then they say that learning difficulties will never be picked up. I'm not sure why that's true. Okay, so all the measures we use to test learning difficulties, like particular tests, like specially trained teachers and psychologists, are all still in place. Moreover, there is still constant opportunity to change streams, right? So if there is something that's undiagnosed, that obviously will bear out when that happens. Then they say that the top students within a class can teach those below. We think to the extent that that is true, it happens better when the gulf between the top students within a class and the ones they're teaching is limited, okay? Because otherwise there can't be as much relation between those two groups of kids. So a really, really smart kid who can do the maths in 10 minutes is actually less able to teach a kid who's struggling with maths than someone who's only slightly better and is just mastering the problem because of that relation. To the extent that that's true, and to the extent that there will be some variation within the streams, that is better under our policy. Secondly, social effects. What we tell you just doesn't get us what I'll illustrate with the negation of the proposition, is that equality in educational terms is greater at a younger age, at a very young age. The reason for that is that at that point, nurture has had a smaller role to play. Right? So there is more equality at age 4 in educational outcomes than there is at age 10. Because by age 10, it means that your parents and your socioeconomic background have far greater impact on your ability to do well. At that point, it becomes self-perpetuating and self-sustaining, and it becomes free. What our policy does is allocate resources on a more equalising basis, because it helps those at an early age and gives them more intensive coaching, more intensive training, and in better classes, even though they are not from a higher socioeconomic background. Then he talks about minority students. The analysis about having to self-identify as a group, I'm just not clear why that's relevant. They don't have to put that before, maybe that low self-perception is the result of academic ability, it gets better under this policy. Why? Because a feeling of hopelessness and helplessness goes away. You are, as I said already, always able to aspire to that next step, that next group. Secondly, the feeling that you're not being understood goes away and you gain confidence. In low-performing schools, the pressure to depress your own ability to seem cool goes away because you are in a set where you're amongst people who, just because of the way they were scored very early on, are in that set, and therefore you can do better just by because teaching is more concentrated and for reasons not used. On interaction, the problem at the moment, to the extent that stratification, like different social groups within schools, occurs on the basis of academic ability, like people largely smart people, that result occurs because of the relationship and dynamics in the classroom. So it's when someone puts their hand up and is smart, it's not actually because you're all like wandering around in different sets. To the extent that that's true, this policy helps the fact that there is social stratification within groups based on academic ability. This solves that problem. Because this is a policy that does work all around the world and lifts up all students, I'm very proud to work with us.
Opening up and trying to tell you that there's a world that can exist where we tell students at the age of 5 that you are better than your peers by birth. They fail to address what the purpose of public education is, because assumably this is public education we're talking about, all schools, right? They fail to assess how the classroom and curriculum are actually taught, and they fail to assess the impact on students who have learning disabilities and learning differences, and they leave everyone else behind. We think that's a significantly worse outcome for the entirety of society, and we think that's the reason we should close. So first, I'll go through some moral these products, and then we'll talk about 3 distinct ones. First, I'll explain why we're doing education. Then, I'm going to talk about learning disabilities and differences and how this destroys their capability to achieve. Second, how this is worse for talented students. And third, how this creates a double stigma of students who grow up in poverty, and how it disables them from ever rising out of that poverty. So first, he says it's malicious standards in education, because if you have some kids that read at a slower ability, or pick up literacy and vocabulary at a slower rate, perhaps due to not having parents who speak English at home, then somehow you have to teach the lowest common standard of literacy in that class. I tell you, give them a different book. It's really, really easy to teach a subject area with 2 different books. No. They do this all the time in public education in states that launch public education, right? There are some words, some books with lower vocabulary that challenges those students at their level, and some books with higher vocabulary that challenges those students at their level. And then there are reading groups that talk about themes, right? And they get together to help each other learn new vocabulary. It's really not a toxic environment where Roxana is sitting there, stop reading Dr. Seuss. Well, you should really be reading, I don't know, Pick the Laptop, right? That's not how it works. You give them different books, it's fine, right? Second, it's like this makes the social effects better. It really helps out the poor students. What? He tells us that the difference between achievement and poverty doesn't result until the age of 10? Are you kidding? It's the first 5 years. It's about nutrition, it's about having safe sleeping environments, it's about feeling safe at home, it's about having English. Things manifest before the age of 10, and if you single them out well before that, you single them out being able to go to the highest level of education, being taught at the highest level of their ability. Because it's not like we just teach you, to your level, and we make you feel really good about it. You're told that you're not at the level you should be. You're told that you're not at the level of your peers. You're told you're not at the level of your age group, and that somehow your fault, and you need to be taken out of that classroom. It's ridiculous to say that you feel really touchy-feely about being singled out at the age of 5, right? Low self-perception is created by this environment, not, solved by. Then he tells us about human nature. Competitiveness is in human nature, therefore do it. No, there's a lot of things in human nature that we actively work against because they're terrible for society. Singling out children and telling them that they're better than everyone else by simultaneously telling the other students that they're in fact worse than they ought to be is not the kind of society that we want. It doesn't teach the skills necessary to have good citizens. Positive. First, public education is about educating the public, not educating the top potential students only, not about just putting so much pressure on them to hope you get a rocket scientist out of 1 in 10, right? You still get rocket scientists in America sometimes in the elementary public education. Like, it's okay, guys. It's about teaching the lowest common denominator and raising that bar always. You don't do that when you lower expectations. You tell children specific way that they ought to learn, that they can't learn. And that is a lifetime disability you're setting on these children. We think that's absolutely abhorrent. Go ahead.
All of this presupposes that when Tom says at the start of this speech that we should care most about high-performing students isn't true. Will you give us a reason that we should care about equality more than overall social good?
This isn't about equality. I never said you should teach everyone the exact same thing all the time and make sure that they have the exact same outcome all the time. Right? This is about creating good people, good learners, and people that are adapted to live in a society that isn't just one of pure competition. Secondly, this is terrible for talented students. One, it tells them that they are better than everyone else. Every time they underperform in that environment, they are down on themselves, they discourage themselves, and they have extreme pressure in their environment. You don't need to teach a 10-year-old like calculus. You really don't. They'll get to it. It'll be okay if they learn by the time they're 18. I promise. They don't get dumber by the time they're 18 and incapable of learning calculus, but it releases the pressure at age 10 so that maybe they can be a kid for a little while. Maybe they can learn some compassion for students who don't have the same abilities, for students that have disabilities. Compassion is the second thing we learn in a different mixed ability classroom. You learn compassion for those who aren't as talented in areas you are as talented. You learn compassion for those who have disabilities, who have learning disabilities and social differences, and you're taught to have compassion for people that may not be born with the best circumstances like you. We think those are important skills that public education needs to access. The third, that's the double stigma of poverty. This is what my partner talked about. It's a little late, whatever, right? Students are already disadvantaged from birth because of nutrition and lack of learning at home. You doubly stigmatize them by putting them in a lower achieving classroom where they learn at a slower pace than others, and they're told they are learning at a slower pace than others. We think this destroys the aims of public education. We think this is permanently disabling for most
Mr. Speaker, one of the central problems in terms of raising the attainment of children from working class backgrounds, creating an environment in which that attainment is acceptable. The only way to do that is to create the kind of environments at a young age where individuals haven't internalized hatred of a system and created a micro-community wherein they feel they're able to express themselves fully. Well, we're going to bring you in extension two things. First of all, why at younger ages people tend to be more equivalent and tend to be less abrasive towards a system and consequently engage with that system better. Secondly, why the identity construction of people in lower streams is still likely to be comparatively better because you don't have a constant visual reminder that you are the thick kid in the class, and why that is problematic in terms of children's identities. Firstly, three things in a row. First thing, they tell us that there's a major difference in terms of the first 5 years of children's education. That is true on either side of the house. The reality is that it gets exponentially worse in situations where people feel they have to mark themselves out because they are not the right kid. They have to mark themselves out as something else. They usually choose something like the troublemaker or somebody who stands up to authority. In that case, that's very damaging for their education because they refuse it outright. It's not that they don't have the skills, it's that they construct themselves as somebody who doesn't want it. Secondly, their case relies on the idea that equality is important, right? It ignores the fact that from opening government we've had the analysis as to why we should tend to prioritise the better children, but also the fact that there's obviously an opportunity cost related to education, and the fact is we need to prioritise resources as efficiently as possible. The reality is that you have the most efficient prioritisation of resources when people have similar abilities. Lindsay says, give them a different book. We think the reality is that you're going to have very intensive differential resources and different levels of teachers within the same classroom, which necessarily hurt the level of provision for both children, right? For both sets of children. It's not simply a case of this type of education they receive, but it's the fact that in costing more it means that you are unable to provide a better standard of education for those people. So firstly, in terms of the community, no. The reality is that for most, the major problem for attainment is not necessarily your level of attainment, it's not necessarily your innate ability, but the epistemic environment in which you find yourself. The reality is, at a younger age, children tend to be far less abrasive towards schooling than they are at the kinds of ages that opening opposition wants to talk about where people do reject schooling. Why is that? Several reasons. First of all, because they haven't yet internalised hatred of a system, right? They haven't yet internalised the idea that teachers are people who need to be stood up to. But second of all, because prepubescent children tend to not have the desire to assert themselves in quite the same way to try and prove themselves as adults. In that case, they don't have the natural antagonism towards teachers that other individuals that they might do later on. In that case, they very often want to are very young. In that circumstance, when you encode those ideas at a very early age by creating a community of individuals, all of whom feel able to do that, it means that you don't get what we see amongst the black community in Chicago and amongst other working class communities, where bright children do very well at the start of their education, but as they're within a peer group of people who don't believe that doing well is a good thing they should do, they tend to fall behind within the classroom. At the point when you create that kind of environment, it means you don't get that rejection. No thanks. But secondly, note that many children don't yet have a well-developed sense of self at the time at which they're taken to be, at the time at which our policy takes them to be streamed, right? They don't have the idea that they are stupid or that they are clever. They simply internalize themselves as, you know, James, right? In that circumstance, when you place them in a climate where doing well is acceptable, right, you make it more likely that they are going to want to do well, because children generally choose their identities from what their peers are doing. That's why children tend to try and dress like the way that their peers are doing, and tend to behave in the same way as their peers do. In circumstances where they are placed in a situation where they feel where they can copy others who are doing well, it means they are less likely to fall behind and less likely to fall into the kinds of communities that would be harmful to them. I'll take those.
But doesn't your model just create more incentives for rich parents to ensure that their small children are better than the poor small children, so that they can steal the spots from the highest classes?
Well, I think that incentive exists anyway. The problem is under the status quo, what you have is a situation where pushy parents push teachers to ignore children who aren't doing very well within the classroom, which means that those children get entirely ignored within a homogeneous environment. In a circumstance where you have different levels of attainment and different classes, it means that you're able to get tailored learning environments. This is the second thing in terms of lower streams identity construction. Because open opposition wants to tell us there are lots of different ways of learning. There are things like non-didactic learning that are not simply competitive. That is true. But the reality is, it's very often the case that people who do less well at school suffer from the same problems. So, for example, the reality is that most children who get grades below C level at GCSE in the United Kingdom are either kinesthetic or visual learners. In that circumstance, it means that they learn by looking at pictures and looking and doing, rather than by listening and through verbal communication. In that circumstance, where you're able to prioritise that sort of communication to those individuals, they do comparatively better in that classroom environment. The reality is that that doesn't happen under their side of the house. Why is that? Firstly, because teachers very often don't have the skills to be able to do that, right? Because they try and teach to everybody. But secondly, because people become ignored. Because these guys want us to talk about group learning, right? It is true that group learning is valuable, but only in situations of relatively equal abilities. Otherwise, you simply defer to the person who is telling you the information. In that way, it becomes functionally the same as lecturing, and you don't get the big advantage of group learning, which is working together to build up skills to come to a particular answer. In that circumstance, you lose out. But what's more, you also don't discover the kinds of special needs that they wanted, because you don't get people coming forward because they don't want to make a fuss in the classroom, and equally, because you don't get the kind of tailored learning that we need. But what's more, even in environments where you can physically see other children doing well and know that you cannot gain access to that, when you're trying to assert your individuality as a child, you generally try and construct yourself as a troublemaker, right? That means that even if the quality of education improves, as the opposition wanted, you reject that education outright because that is simply not part of your identity, right? In that circumstance, and equally, teachers come to view you as that. They view you as an obstacle to doing well within the classroom, rather than somebody who simply has fundamentally different needs. In that circumstance, you don't get the kind of tailored education that they want. Now, these guys say, well, that's symmetric, right? Because it hurts your self-esteem to be placed in a classroom where it's deemed to be the less able classroom. The reality is, children tend not to think on a continuously macro level, right? Children, for example, don't think of themselves on a national spectrum. They equally don't think of themselves on the school spectrum. They compare themselves to their direct peers, the ones they interact with every day. At the point where you equalise that, it means you don't construct yourself as a stupid child. You instead start to think of yourself as doing better, and you do physically do that. Very much.
We think firstly,
what this does in terms of minorities and people who currently do badly, and why the socialization effects are such that when they're screened early, you get people doing better, even from minorities which otherwise wouldn't do. And secondly, we'll have poor performers and good performers in classrooms, and when it doesn't need an identity construction, that's at the house, what to talk about, they need beneficial ones. First, there's several points of responsibility just here from Rebecca. One, on teachers. The first thing I want to point out is the problem that people do badly is the one Jack identifies. And when you see someone do badly, you identify them early age as troublemakers and often ignore that individual at all. Rebecca points out that the incentives right now are such that you don't want to ignore students overall, but you do care about their lower range yet. That is true to some degree, right? And that's exactly the reason why you don't pay the teaching managers and spend a lot of time on those who otherwise do very well. Because you know that's not necessarily what you're going to be rewarded for, because most school boards will realize that you're going to have one or two good kids, and you instead ignore those children, or instead teaching to the median at best of all that large and large groups of individuals. She points out that, for instance, if you teach in a full classroom, why would you care at all? Because people are already written off. Well, you can still just value how good the teacher is. You're just using different metrics. You use metrics like you do right now, like value metrics. The fact is how much better you make them to be. We don't think that's a huge problem. It's not the same performance metrics on teachers. Secondly, on resources. The first thing I want to point out is it's always going to be true that some rich pushing parents are going to be able to push more than other parents. That's true of the state as well. But more importantly, we think this is to some degree symmetrical. That poor kid, or the kid who otherwise would be considered to be a write-off by their parents, or the parents wouldn't have thought to be so good and ends up extremely well, might not even put place more pressure. They talk about one side where they're trying to make them class well, and on the other side where they need to do better or more well. I think it's often very useful in terms of that pressure on the other side. I'll deal with two more arguments if I think that's the case. So first, on the issue of equality, Rebecca Coach was very interesting when she says, if you simply take a bunch of kids who've been socialized for the first 5 years into an environment they're not used to, they'll simply curl up and they simply won't do well at all. I simply think that's untrue. Why? Because when individuals are young, they're far more likely to have a growing degree of natural curiosity and far less of a sense of their own social status. Most people who are like 5 or 6 years old won't be able to tell you which class they're in. They're probably able to tell you, for instance, their name. And they're probably able to more identify with a larger group and a vast group of individuals. That's why you don't get that level of intimidation. Why is this particularly important? It's particularly important when you understand that even though there are differences between people at age 5, they seem to grow more and more over time. Yes, there will be differences for all the reasons Orthodox should talk about, but they do grow over time. The simple fact that English people get institutionalized into the academic environment which are already in. So, for instance, look for instance at black students, the group which Orthodox quite rightly wanted to talk about. In many circumstances, we look at the empirical evidence. Black students seem to lose their friends as they do better and better in school. Why is this incredibly normal? When you face, for instance, that negative incentive to do well in school, which is social process, you never do so, even though you might be very well in the first place. Why does this policy come? If you take an individual who might not necessarily be as good as they could potentially be, but still with a low level difference that happened many years later, and you take them at a young age. At a young age, they are far less likely to be influenced by those external factors for a couple of reasons. First, is that partners like to want to assert themselves easily in the future at a young age when they're prepubescent and that. Second, is in many of those circumstances, but they don't have any impact, they haven't internalized themselves with their sense of self, and something because they care so much about other people's opinions in those cases. So even though a gap exists at the early age, we think it's often that they haven't internalized those views and they face the same kind of negative connotations they do with later years. So if at that stage you bring those people into stream classrooms, why is that beneficial? Because they interact with another and new group of students which doesn't necessarily have the same values. They're able to perpetuate the values, the value of, for instance, doing well in school, the value, for instance, of educational attainment. And those of you that these individuals who might know very bright are able to gain those which are otherwise never will be able to do so. Let's talk about poor performance in schools overall. We hear a lot from opening oppositions and saying that, look, if you tell a kid he's bad, he's going to construct his identity as bad. The point which Jack Bell is going to explain to us that most people construct their identities based on their differences between people on a proximate level. When I'm 10 years old, I don't really understand my place in society overall. I don't really think of myself in terms of where I benefit from the 20 streams of the classroom or all the streams overall. I really do think of myself in terms of where I fit in that individual classroom. In those students I'm in a particular classroom and I'm a low performer, I do see myself as someone who isn't going to do well overall and to internalize that in myself. ones that probably don't do well. If, for instance, I see myself in a low ability classroom doing reasonably well, that entire technical construction is very different. It's the way in which most people ultimately understand their identity. That's in the house because it's just a couple of offsetting benefits, a couple of great advantages which you have as a result of this policy. They said, well, actually just mentioned.
If you can teach different abilities, which all classes do, what is the purpose of separating children into slow learning classes when they know?
Okay, you can teach people different abilities, and you can sometimes even teach them in the same classroom, maybe the book example again. You can't do that in all circumstances, and in multiple circumstances, you can't. Why? For instance, you might want to specialize teachers with specialized skills, so watch how to train them, how to deal with people with educational difficulties, or how to deal with people who just simply aren't learning knowledge. That is massively beneficial. It's not simply the case of the book learning in those circumstances. That's what has what we call high those students that simply help students classroom at all. In the first place, lots of these high those students don't have that impact on the classroom environment because they often feel bad about doing very well in they do very well in these environments. They don't want to be the super smart kids that they might face on that social status. They often do less well and don't provide all those benefits. But more importantly, we don't think group learning often works in the same way they want. Why? Because all that often does is transfer knowledge, learning, understanding overall. What you can understand at the end of this debate is if, and I stress if, equality is the primary value which we have. This is not something which helps. What this policy does is allow individuals who otherwise be in harmful environments, harmful epistemic environments, to get out of it early. That means that all people students can do better with the identity construction in place. I'm very happy to
I think what the side government had ignored about what the broader distinction was the fact that the envelope changes the incentives on people in the education system. It changes the incentives on parents, both rich and poor. It changes the incentives on teachers and which classes they have to teach. And it changes the incentive on schools and the way that they direct resources. And so I think one of the fundamental failures of their case is to actually take account of that and how the world changes because of that. What they had to prove is two things. Number one, that they were going to improve they were going to basically help poor kids do better under their system, and secondly, that overall educational quality would improve. I'm going to look at those two areas to sum up this debate. So first of all, let's talk about social inequality. And the basic point that government realized at first was that all students perform similarly at an early age. Therefore, if we get them at an early age, we can get them before any of the social advantages come into play. And we had a great statement of that at closing government when they said children don't provide digital instruction at an early age. Okay, the problem with this point is, as Harish notes, richer parents have advantages already that they can transfer to their children from the age of 0, from when they're playing books out to their babies in their tummies, okay? So those advantages already exist. The problem with their model is it locks those advantages in. Because what changes under their model is now, richer parents notice that they need their 5-year-old to be good at reading already to get into the top class, and make sure their 5-year-old is good at reading and gets into the top class. Given there's going to be
have massively high-performing students in their class, i.e. the status quo? Why